Hi Booktube, it's Ros, and this is the early January, and I'm going to give you my December reading wrap-up, delights, discoveries, and any disappointments. And I read 13 books in December, or finished 13 books in December, I will say. Two of those were really exceptional novels, which are also featuring in my review of my best reads of the year, so I won't say a lot about them. And a third novel that I read was also very special, although didn't kind of make it into my best of the year, and that's The Old Man and His Sons by Hedin Bru, Faroese author from the sort of mid 20th century, and that was so interesting that I'm going to do an individual review of that book, a kind of a scally-dandling video as it's from the Faroes. So I won't talk about that. I have one book. When I say I finished 13, I have one book that I sort of was well on the way through at the end of this month, which I want to just mention because it was the other rather odd book I read in December, along with The Old Man and His Sons, and it's The House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski. And I want to mention it now because I want to say, have you read it? And if you have read it, I'd love to hear something about your views of it. If you're not part of it, we've got like a Discord group running for the group read of it. But if you're not in that group, but you could give me your views about it sort of now. I'd love to have them now rather than wait till I do my January wrap up at the end of January, because I find I'm fluctuating between thinking, wow, this book is extraordinary and really interesting and complex and wonderful, and thinking, goodness me, this is a load of old tosh, how pretentious, how ridiculous, and I also suspect that the author may have wanted me to think both those things. So comment below if you have thoughts. Now, House of Leaves is in some ways kind of experimental fiction, and in other ways could also be seen as like a horror novel, something I don't normally read. And that was fitting for me because December is when I do my genre Christmas challenge, when I read lots of sort of genre books, which is something that I don't do a lot of through the rest of the year, every now and then. December and Christmas seem to be sort of associated with mysteries and detective fiction, don't they? Like this Cloak and Dagger Christmas, and this year there was Berner and Kevy's readathon, Christie's Missing, that I took part in, and so I think that's one of the things that's got me onto my sort of genre December thing. So I did read several kind of crime come mystery things. I did a play which I discussed with Tilly by Agatha Christie. I also read the Sitterford mystery by Agatha Christie, which was it's reliably enjoyable, isn't it, when you read one of those? There's something predictable about reading Agatha Christie that's reassuring, even though it's about death. I went old school and read a Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes novella, The Sign of Four, which again, sort of safe, comforting. I mean, even though it's about, nastiness, there's a safe feeling about it, isn't there? It doesn't do to dwell too hard on those Sherlock Holmes stories because you realise that it's all completely ridiculous. But as long as you leave that to one side, they're tremendous, tremendous fun. Do read one if you never have. I then went kind of like up to date, but in a similar kind of mode, I suppose, because I read Richard Obisman's Thursday Murder Club, which is just a really good example of your sort of relatively cosy amateur detective crime fiction. I think that Osman is a very clever chap. In fact, I know he's a very clever chap, but you've seen him interviewed and so on, and I think he kind of really sat down and thought, I enjoy crime fiction of this sort. I'm going to analyse what makes a good one, and I'm going to put all those elements into my book. And it's got the it's got the perfect formula, you know, around plot and characters and you know, a little bit of nastiness, but quite a bit of humour as well, and a nice setting. And you can see the film or TV adaptation. You know, as you read it, you can picture it, and the character actors that will play the protagonists. And one of the particularly likeable things about it is that it, like Agatha Christie with her Miss Marple, it has sort of that thing of the older sort of amateur sleuth who other people might underestimate. Extra appeal for me is that it's set quite locally to me, which was nice. So that was crime and mystery as a genre. The only bit of science fiction I did this year was quite small, but I'm glad I did all the same, because what I did was I read volume 1 of Genu, I'm not sure how it's pronounced actually, to be honest, which is a graphic novel in 5 parts. And this was also part of my little thing of reading books by booktubers, because one of the writers on Genu is Tom of Tomele Books, and it's kind of, I'm not sure yet whether it's dystopian or utopian sort of future kind of science fiction. It's good. I was drawn in, but it's very much only volume 1. And I think, and also I got it as an ebook, and it's quite clever how, you know, you can read graphic novels as ebooks, but nevertheless, I think I'm now going to wait till volume 5 comes out later this year and then buy a paper omnibus edition of the whole thing and just sort of really embed myself into it more enjoyably. So that was my bit of science fiction. Then fantasy. So I'm not a big fantasy reader, but one of the things that I really wanted to do was finish N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy, which I started about, it was probably a year and a half ago, and this is part 3. Now, this was not a delight, nor obviously not a discovery, because it's part 3 of a trilogy. It was almost a disappointment. Now, I'm probably going to upset a few people by saying that, because, you know, people love Jemisin and this particular trilogy, you know, with a passion, I think, and you know, it's won lots of awards, you know, well, lots of awards. It's won the Hugo Award, all 3 parts, which is, you know, it's almost never happened before. And I really loved part 1 of the trilogy, and I was entirely satisfied with part 2. This one, for me, and if you've read it, you can tell me why I'm wrong, but for me, it kind of just went off the rails a bit. I don't know, almost sort of too chaotic, you know, tried to pack too much in. I was about to say it became improbable. Now, that is a really stupid thing to say about fantasy, isn't it? You know, it became improbable. But I think you might understand what I mean when it's like its internal logic started to break down for me. So, slight disappointment, but I'm pleased to have completed the trilogy. And there's some great kind of ideas and metaphors in this around sort of, you know, sort of race and so on, I think, you know, that are clever and interesting. That was that one. Now, my son Alf, who you've sometimes seen on this channel, is a real fantasy enthusiast. He reads a lot, and one of his favourite authors is Brandon Sanderson. So I said to him, if I want to get a taste of Brandon Sanderson, but not buy into some sort of 12-book, 14-book series of great fat things, which I'm just not going to do, what should I read? And he, you know, because I know that Sanderson is like one of the big names in fantasy, and he told me that I should read The Emperor's Soul, which is a kind of a 120 page maybe novella. He lent me this collection so that I could read it, but it's a standalone novella, The Emperor's Soul, and I was really impressed. I can see why Sanderson is so huge in the fantasy world. Is very, very readable, and the contrast between this and the Jemisin was that it was really tight. he really, the internal logic was 100% held, in terms of the plot, but also the characters, their psychology, their motivation, and what you might call the magic system. It all worked. So it was a discovery in the sense that I think I've discovered what his appeal is. I'm still not going to embark on a 12-volume series, but, I can see why people enjoy it. Now, the next kind of fantasy thing I want to mention, it was more of a discovery for me, because it was a new author for me, Maria Darana Headley, and I don't have it, I read her novel from, I think it was 2018, called The Mere Wife, and it appealed to me because it's described as a retelling of the Beowulf story. And it is a retelling of the Beowulf story. It's kind of dystopian fantasy, though set in quite a world that's very close to the real world, if you know what I mean. It's not sort of way off fantasy. It's sort of within a sort of recognizable American setting, I'd say, and modern, relatively contemporary. It's a very ambitious book, and it's not perfect. It was like a 4-star read for me, I suppose, but I felt predominantly she pulls it off. It works for me, and it's pacey, it's psychologically interesting, it's got lots of atmosphere, it's got some real moments of real drama, it's got ideas, and the thing that I like best, I guess, is that she obviously really, really embedded herself in the original Beowulf, but then rather than reproducing that directly, she sort of just draws on it. And you can tell that she really embedded herself in Beowulf, because 2 years later, 2020, she brought out a new translation of Beowulf, a kind of feminist translation, which I do have and which I'm planning to read sometime this year. So, in fact, I hope to read it alongside the Seamus Heaney version of Beowulf, which is the sort of, I don't know, the most admired one of the 20th century. I think it's 20th, not early 21st. Yeah. So, my last fantasy book was also a way of bringing, I always feel like if I'm doing a genre sort of spell of genre reading, I ought to try and read something sort of YA, young adulty, but it's not. It rarely works for me. So I cheated. And what I read was Puck of Pook's Hill by Rudyard Kipling, which Kipling wrote or published in 1906. Okay, so this is not current YA novel. This is old style, but it is fantasy. Well, it's kind of on the cusp between fantasy and historical fiction, which is another of the genres I really got into this month. When you read Kipling, okay, you have to be prepared for the fact that he was writing at the end of the 19th or the beginning of the 20th century. He came from a very particular background, and he had a set of ideas around sort of, I don't know, British nationalism. I don't know, almost like national destiny, to have an empire and rule the world, and that was like a good thing, I suppose, and that your English middle and upper classes have a sort of a special virtue, perhaps, and duty around that, and that is embedded in this book. But it's also wonderful stories. It goes back through it's based in Sussex, the farm, which is where the county where I live, the house and the area around it where he was living. It's through the eyes of children that who sort of connect with Puck, the sort of primeval folk figure in sort of British folk tales, as in Shakespeare, Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream, that draws on that same tradition, and they're sort of taken back to meet characters from history, like Romans, and great fun, warm recommendation, as long as you can kind of stomach the fact that sometimes it goes a bit sort of British imperialist in its thinking, not explicitly, but in its thinking. So, which kind of segues me nicely into historical fiction, which I probably had the most enjoyment out of in my genre month. Two of those wound up being in my best books of the year, best novels of the year. One of those is The Wreath by Sigrid Undset, the last part of her Christian Lavransdatter trilogy. So I won't say more about that because I'm talking about it there. But it's historic. It's written in the 1920s or published in the early 1920s. It's set in 14th century Norway. This is a brilliant translation by Tina Nunnally. Don't be tempted to read any other translation of Sigrid Undset's work, this trilogy. And it does what historical fiction should do, of absolutely taking you into the mindset and world of the time and place in which it's set. That was that. Secondly, and again, one of my absolute top books of the year, was Palace Walk by Nagi Mafus, who was written in 1956 about a family in Cairo in 1917, 1819. So historical fiction, even when he wrote it. That was so good that not only is it in my best books of the year, I did a discussion on Zoom with Tom, and that's already up on my channel. So I will zip my mouth about that one. But do read it. Do please read it. Third historical fiction I read was just definitely a delight. Definitely counts as a delight. Or not one of my top books of the year, but very definitely a delight. This was the third time this month I finished a trilogy, which is always that's a great thing to do at the end of the year, isn't it? It's like, oh, good, wrap that up, close the covers on that book. Robert Harris's book Dictator is part 3 of a trilogy that he wrote in the around sort of early 20-teens about Cicero, and it's a brilliant vehicle for writing about the end of the Roman Republic, the rise of Julius Caesar, and then the death of Julius Caesar, and at the end of this book, Octavian, who will become the Emperor Augustus, is sort of taking control. So it's a lovely sweep of Roman history in these books, but done with such verve and vigour and incredibly strong characterization, and plotted almost like a kind of a thriller in interest. Definitely a winner. If you haven't read Robert Harris's historical fiction, comes with a enthusiastic recommendation for me. It's not the epitome of great literature like something like Palace Walk or the Sigrid Undset, but it's just bloody good historical fiction. So that was a delight. Now, sadly, the other historical fiction book I read, which I expected to be a delight, was possibly my greatest disappointment of the month. No, it was definitely the greatest disappointment of the month. And that was The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams. Came out in 2020. She's Australian, but it's set in England, in Oxford. It should have been a brilliant book. It's about the women who were involved in the writing of the Oxford English Dictionary in the like at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century, and the premise for it is superb, but she just completely mucked it up. That's my view. I mean, some people have loved that book, and again, tell me if why I'm wrong, but for me, I've spent the first half of it waiting for it to really take off, and the second half thinking I just want this to end, but I invested so much in it, and I kept thinking, oh no, somehow it'll come together, and it jolly well never did. So that's my rant about the Dictionary of Lost Words. Don't bother reading it. That's my opinion, but some of you will disagree. So great month. And how was your December? tell me your delights and discoveries of your December reading. And did you have any satisfying finishing of things? Do you finish things for the end of the year? Yeah, it's a nice. It's good, satisfying feeling for me. But maybe that's daft because it's an artificial construct, isn't it? Time and 31st of December. What's that really? Bye.